We got quite a few responses to the previous videos. I'm just gonna respond to the responses now. The first one I want to talk about is from Hugh Cresswell. He said the following: where you discussed Abigail not performing anymore, you missed how it's specifically her not performing the role of Ollie anymore, not performing the character who she used to be. Similar remarks were also made by others, and of course Hugh Cresswell is perfectly right. When Abigail says that she's not performing anymore, what she means to say is that she's no longer performing masculinity, she's no longer falsely taking on or displaying a male persona, now that she came out as feminine. So she's not performing a gender that she doesn't identify with anymore. And she's showing her real self. And of course, Hugh is right pointing this out, and I also understood this. But there's still a paradox here. And this paradox is nothing that is personally about Abigail or that's wrong. It's just a general paradox. That's important to point out, because what we're doing here is philosophy, so we're not talking about any individual, but we're talking about general questions. Now, the paradox is the following. Basically, there are two levels to it. Number one, she of course still performs a gender. So she, for instance, through the hairstyle, through dress, through gestures and so forth, these are all ways to perform a certain gender. So it doesn't really matter which gender she performs. Any gender is to a certain extent and must be performed, otherwise we couldn't notice it. And then, interestingly enough, she also performs, that's the second level of the paradox, she also performs that she's not performing, right? She stresses, I am not performing, and this in itself is also a performance. It's a stage performance. It's scripted, edited, posted on the social media. And again, in the same way, this is nothing that is bad or wrong. It's just that is an inherent paradox that if you want to express that you're not performing, then you must do so in the form of a performance. The point is that both gender identity and any identity as such is always performed. It always has this element of being expressed in the form of a performance. Now, this was also captured very well by another comment by Atopia, who writes, like pretending to have a personal identity is the personal identity itself. And I think this is just perfectly put. I couldn't put that any better. And it's exactly this point that we, Paul D'Ambrosia and I, try to capture with the expression genuine pretending, which is an intentionally paradoxical expression that is supposed to express exactly the same point, that identity is performed, and through the performance it is experienced as genuine, both by the performer and by the audience of the performance. So genuineness is not, so to speak, the origin of the performance, but it is the result of the performance. And to take on an identity and to have an identity and to express an identity is based on this paradoxical combination of a performance that then, through the performance, is experienced to a certain extent as no longer being a performance. So genuineness is an effect of pretending. Real personal identity is an effect of a performance. And that is just a general condition of existence. And that's what we call genuine pretending. And then there are different technologies of achieving this form of real self through a performance. And these three different technologies, we just, there may be many more, but the three different ones we were discussing are sincerity, authenticity, and profilicity. With regard to the performance of identity, I was pointing out that none of these three technologies really gets identity right. And there were a few comments on this that I also want to talk about. First, KL says, none of these get identity right. Is it possible to get identity right? What are some better alternatives to these technologies, if there are any? And again, we have another person who already provides an answer to this, or a response that I totally agree with, namely Sebastian Hosu, who writes, I can't say for sure, but I guess the implication is that there is no such thing as a right identity. As identity is a construction, one uses one of the technologies to construct it. Whichever one you use, the identity is an artifact that functions in accordance with the used technology. And again, this is perfectly said. I couldn't put it any better. Inherently, identity is not only paradoxical, genuine pretending, but also, and this is different, it's also incongruent, it's incongruous. There is no natural perfect match between the different dimensions of one's identity. That is, for instance, the bodily characteristics one has, including one's sex, the mental experiences one has, what one thinks and feels, and then the social conditions within which one exists. All these three different realms are inherently incongruous, right? Our thoughts and feelings are very complex. They don't fully match, right? And then, of course, also biological characteristics are, first of all, they're kind of random. And then secondly, they're also neither stable nor somehow congruent. And then thirdly, of course, the social situation that one is basically born into and then somehow has to live with are also not in somehow a natural correspondence to all these other dimensions of what constitutes human life. The technologies of identity typically, nevertheless, somehow presume that there is something like a perfect or a natural match of all these different dimensions, and that's simply wrong. Just to give one example, like under the conditions of sincerity, for instance, typically gender roles are somehow assumed to be naturally correct, right? Different philosophies, different religions, different ethics, like we refer to the Confucian ethics as one example of many, would, for instance, say, this is the right way to be a woman, right? This is the right way to be a mother, this is the right way to be a daughter, and so forth. Counterfactually, what these identity technologies suggest is that you can somehow get identity right, which of course then also has the consequence that if somehow you experience, which is only normal, that you actually somehow not fully getting identity right, then it's your fault. Right? Because the technology suggests identity is set up in such a place that once you fully commit to it, things will be all right. So actually, trying to get identity right, in many cases, is actually making it worse. It leads to some forms of identity fundamentalism. And this is again what many philosophies or religions or ethics try to insist on. They kind of say, you must be really sincere. You must be really commit. If you're not really getting your identity right so far, you must try harder. And this leads to all kinds of pathologies. It leads to psychological pathologies, but it also leads to social pathologies. It leads to all kinds of, fundamentalism, that I so fully commit whatever to my religion that I turn into a martyr, that I kill myself or other people. Or that we establish a family structure which has very rigid and very suppressive characteristics to it, just to kind of insist that this is the right way to enact a gender role. And a similar thing can happen in authenticity, right? We have in the early times of authenticity, we have novels like, for instance, Goethe's novel, the German author, the young Werther, a young person who experiences authenticity and wants to experience it and then commits suicide. And we have an early kind of a suicide fashion where people express their authenticity through committing suicide, through being like non-conformist. You have this also actually in Dostoevsky's novel, The Demons, with the character Kirillov. And then today we have this kind of hyper-individualism, where uniqueness and originality are on the one hand expected of everyone, and then we have also kind of social conventions that kind of to a pathological extent, overstress forms of authenticity. And then, of course, we also have an excess of profilicity, right? Whatever YouTubers who burn out. I'm kind of experiencing that myself already. But it's also in other forms where you end up with some form of profile frenzy. You get stressed out by living up to your profile. So this is where Taoism comes in, because it basically advises to be cautious about over-identifying, to be cautious about overly committing to a certain identity. And it basically aims at easing, at relaxing identifications. The way to do it is simply by acknowledging, understanding the notion of genuine pretending, understanding that identity is both paradoxical and incongruous. And this is what allows to establish identity, and trying to get identity right, to make it not paradoxical or to make it no longer incongruous, is an impossible task. This brings us to the next set of remarks, one here by Querent, who says, "I too am guilty of constructing profiles and avatars as a means to express my own inner sense of authenticity." Now, this very nicely expresses the pressure of a regime of authenticity, that Querent feels guilty of not being authentic enough. And so this is like a perfect expression of, as I just said, the pressures of authenticity, where you always have the feeling that you're not authentic enough, you're not original enough, you're not unique enough, you're not your real self enough. So you don't get authenticity right. And of course, the point of pointing out how profilicity works, which is what I tried to do in the last video, is by no means to say that being profilic, being engaged in profilicity and profile curation, is something that is inauthentic. It is non-authentic because it doesn't operate on the basis of the authenticity paradigm. It doesn't employ the authenticity technology. But this does not mean that it is inauthentic. It is only inauthentic if you set up authenticity as an ideal. So what is inauthentic from the perspective of authenticity is simply non-authentic from the perspective of profilicity, or from the perspective of sincerity, for that matter. So the notion of deficiency, that you somehow lack in something, only arises if you identify, or let's say over-identify, with a certain paradigm, with a certain technology. So Querent should not feel guilty, right? The moment that you feel guilty is the very moment that signals that you somehow starting to over-identify with a specific technology, and that you're kind of forgetting about the existential condition of genuine pretending. So Querent shouldn't be stressed out. Now there's another remark by J. Fafo, and it says, "Profilicity could be further expanded on from Baudrillard's conception of simulacra, simulation, the hyperreal, and so forth." And several people mentioned Baudrillard, so that was interesting to see. And of course, they are right. Baudrillard, in his works, described a lot of phenomena that we, Paul and I, now describe in terms of profilicity, and we're trying to develop a new vocabulary for this that's different from Baudrillard's vocabulary. But we're definitely referring to very similar, if not the same, phenomena. However, Baudrillard, somewhat like Querent, also expresses quite often, quite frequently, something like an authenticity nostalgia. He has an authenticity bias. His writings do express an authenticity bias. And he sort of bemoans these hyper-real facts. And we have this with other authors too, like many of the French authors who are very kind of enthusiastic about authenticity and about being original. It seems to be very much also a thing of French intellectuals. And we have it, like, I think nowadays with someone like this Korean-German writer Byung-Chul Han, right? They are similarly basically expressing some form of authenticity nostalgia. And saying, oh, the modern world, it suffers from a lack of authenticity. And again, like really, I don't really think that's a good theoretical point to make, because at least not from the perspective of genuine pretending, because then you idealize one form at the expense of another form of identity formation. Thereby, you privilege one technology over another technology, and it is precisely this kind of privileging that is the first step to an over-identification, an overestimation of any of the identity technologies, which then again leads to this false ideal of trying to get identity right. Then there were another set of comments about the general peer. This one here is by Tormun7, who says, the general peer sounds to me a lot like the Lacanian concept of the big other. And similarly, Geoffrey Paulo says, general peer equals big other, Lacan Zizek. That's again, these are good observations, and indeed there are some similarities, I guess, between the notion of the general peer and the big other, but there are also very significant differences. The notion of the general peer is not just about the general other, but there's also the peer in it. So the general peer is still a peer. Actually, we developed the notion, Paul and I, also with respect to the notion of the peer review that you have in the academic system, where when you publish a paper or when you publish a book, it has to go through so-called peer review. The peer is not just everyone, it's not just anyone, it's not just the indefinite big other. The peer is still somehow specific. Actually, a much stronger influence than the notion of the big other on our concept of the general peer is from the German social theorist Niklas Luhmann, who I mentioned earlier, who is reflecting in his works on the notion of the public. The German word is Öffentlichkeit. Luhmann was somehow an intellectual opponent of the social theorist Jürgen Habermas, for whom the notion of the public is very crucial. And Habermas' notion of the public, in turn, is very much influenced by Kant's notion of making public use of reason. So there is this notion in the Kantian Habermasian tradition that somehow there is this public sphere, which is the great commons. And out there in the great commons, there can be some form of rational discourse, and rationality will emerge from out of this kind of great common public sphere. Now, Luhmann says, actually, society is divided in all these different social systems, and there is no overarching, no general rationality that combines them all. So in this sense, there is no public sphere as such. We have a multiplicity of public spheres that are all systemic, that belong to different systems. So as I said earlier, one example would be the academic public, which is different, let's say, from the sports public or from whatever, the political public. They exist simultaneously, but they're not the same. And each of them are different. They operate with different semantics. There are different rationalities to it. And you communicate differently, right? If I communicate with the general peer in the academic system, that's very different from communicating with a general peer, let's say, in the sports or in the entertainment system. And again, all function according to different rationality. That's why it is not just simply a big other, but the general peer is a peer, and that's important. Now, secondly, about the general peer, what is very important about the general peer, specifically in connection with profilicity, is the notion of second-order observation. In second-order observation, we somehow join in with the general peer. We amalgamate, we unite with the general peer. So it doesn't remain just some distant other. Let me give you one example. And this is from the American TV show American Idol. It's very popular song contest show, which was like a worldwide success, and then there are many different similar shows in many different countries, so it's been globally adapted. At least initially, the format of the show was that there was a jury who would judge certain performers. Typically, so you watch this jury watching the performance, and the jury itself is actually watched by a studio audience. So the jury is engaging in first order observation. They watch the performance, but we as viewers, we watch already how the studio audience watches the jury watching the performance. Of course, we somehow identify ourselves with the studio audience. This is a show that basically enacts in the form of a performance, second order observation. And we also see, like, if we just look at the jury, of course they are like individuals, and they're very different. The gender is different, the race is different, and they're supposed to represent different temperaments. But of course, again, it's a very kind of a generalization. It's very much a standardization of these attributes. So already on the level of the jury, which represents first order observation, we see this kind of a standardization. And that then gets to the next level with the studio audience. So what the show basically does, it trains us in becoming the general peer, in uniting with the general peer. It's this formation of second order observation which constitutes somehow this general peer in pop music. And so through it we learn what the general peer likes in pop music. And there are no specific criteria for it, right? It's just about what is being liked. And what is being liked is constituted through this formation of the general peer in an enactment of second order observation, in which eventually the whole, let's say, pop music scene unites, right? And again, there's no general rationality like Habermas and Kant were assuming that informs this decision, but it's just kind of this kind of pop music scene that somehow generates taste through this performance, and pop music taste. So again, this I think exemplifies the two important characteristics of the general peer. Number one, that unlike the big other, it is somehow possible to join the general peer. And then secondly, it is system specific, right? And it actually constitutes this specificity. It constitutes, in this case, the notion of taste in pop music, and distinguishes that which is liked and that which is not liked within pop music, without any reference to some form of general overarching rationality. There was another set of remarks about the relation between sincerity and profilicity. I'm gonna read out two. One is by Nupur Chaudhary, who says, "What is the difference between sincerity and profilicity exactly? In both cases, the outside is true and the inside must back it up. So the only difference is that in sincerity, the outside truth is determined by birth, whereas in profilicity, it is determined by other people's perception." And then, I guess, same viewer Sebastian Hosso says, again, "A sincere question that I now have," maybe sincere is used here as a pun, "a sincere question that I now have is the following: to what extent is the proposed profilicity different from the public persona of any famous person in history?" So this remark also seems to point to the similarity between sincerity and profilicity. And yes, of course, both comments are correct. There are many similarities between sincerity and profilicity, and precisely because both build identity by living up to an external persona. Now, still, I think there are very decisive differences. Profilicity, we can say, is much more advanced. In which way? Well, in many ways. Number one, it's multiple. right? Traditional roles, of course, you could also have some form of multiplicity of roles, for instance, as mother and as daughter. But there's still a kind of a strong coherence of these roles, right? They're all, for instance, tied in the female gender. Now, in Profilicity, you can have a multiplicity of profiles that are more or less unrelated, right? Like on all these different, let's say, social media, whatever, if you have a Tinder profile or if you have a LinkedIn profile, they are very different and there is no coherence somehow demanded. And then, of course, they are also much more dynamic. Like traditional social roles, including gender roles, were supposed to be stable, right? Expectations wouldn't really change over generations. Now, with profiles, expectations constantly change. They're constantly subject to changing expectations. Therefore, it also means you need to constantly curate your profiles, right? You need to constantly update. We're speaking of feeds in the social media, right? The profiles have to be constantly fed. So that is also something where sincerity differs from Profilicity. One interesting example of this, a colleague, David Stark, who is a sociology professor at Columbia University in New York, is doing research on electronic music and on the different pseudonyms, the aliases used by performers of electronic music, because they typically have a lot of them. So they enact different personas. These different personas all, to a certain extent, represent different profiles, which allows them, for instance, to play different kinds of music. And then in his research, David Stark has shown what he calls moments of identity. So there's a whole dynamic that's going on depending on, for instance, how much, this is a vocabulary I use, the person is invested in the profile. There can be very different degrees of being invested in your profile, and that's all okay. There is not like a kind of a standard level of being invested in your persona. You can be more detached from the persona, or you can be more enthusiastically invested. You must be invested in it, right? You shouldn't cheat. But there's a whole range of dynamics that is possible there. And this seems to me quite different from the traditional sincerity technology. A final set of questions was about Taoism. Or remarks. I'm quoting first this one here by Jonathan Michael, who says, I actually think Taoism puts forth another model of identity. In Taoism there is a true or fundamental self, perhaps not an individual or singular self though, but it cannot be accessed. You're always in accordance with the Tao, but you may not know it. I don't know. This is just a thought I had. So anyways, I would disagree with Jonathan Michael. I think this is a common misperception of Taoism, that it is somehow tied to the authenticity ideal of the true and fundamental self, which is what Jonathan Michael writes. And actually we have another video on this to critique this authenticity, what I think is a problematic representation of Taoism. As I said, I think Taoism is not really about authenticity, but is about genuine pretending. At least the form of Taoism I'm interested in. I'm not saying that there cannot be an authenticity Taoism. There can also be an authenticity Taoism. But if you allow the pun, I don't think it's the authentic Taoism. It's an Orientalist Western Taoism. Then Aka Oluwe says, I would have a question about identity and the famous butterfly dream of Zhuangzi, and it would go something like this. What about identity and Zhuangzi's butterfly dream? Instead of answering this here, I would like to direct you to the Philosophy in Motion channel, where we animate Zhuangzi stories, and so far we have two, and one of them is exactly the butterfly dream story, so that video answers that question. So, as I already admitted, it causes me some stress to create my new acquired profile as philosophy influencer. But Fai and I, we still are interested in continuing this thing. So I want to talk the next one maybe about a theme that I already discussed earlier, this theme of over-identification, but over-identification under conditions of Profilicity. And I think that actually has quite political relevance. Probably, like as we saw in the recent American election, there is now an increasing conflict which could be called some form of identitarianism and the alt-right on the one hand, and that reflects a certain, focus on identity. And of course then we have also the focus on identity on the left with identity politics and all these issues about wokeness and about political correctness and these things. So I think it makes sense to also look at current developments in politics from the perspective of Profilicity. I want to show two photos, both people on the right expressing their political views in form of a protest while taking selfies of themselves, which was very common during the protest at the US Capitol. But it's equally common at leftist protests about Antifa and so forth. And we have another photo showing this. And I think both these two photos show very clearly the intersection between Profilicity, politics, and identity making. But we'll take some time with this, so I'm going to be a slow influencer.